top-secret commando raid finally decoded.
There's a piece of graffiti up here that unlocked this mystery.
In Argentina, an extreme solution to getting more downtime.
He brought his house to the office.
A baffling tower in Berlin, monument to Hitler's ego.
It remains there as a remnant of Hitler's grandiose vision for himself.
And an Armenian ghost town of caves, once the backdrop for treachery.
He was actually murdered by the same people that he was fighting for.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. On the southeastern tip of England, traces of a secret mission hide in a vast underground complex.
Looking out over the narrowest part of the English Channel stands a grand camouflaged structure.
There's really no chance that anyone approaching from the sea is going to be able to see this thing.
At first glance, the inside gives little away.
The interiors here are very bare and functional. They were clearly designed for strength, not style.
You can see long, dark tunnels and vast caverns full of rubble and dust.
For years, the wartime history of this place didn't seem to add up. Until indistinct wall markings finally offered up some clues.
Many of the walls are covered in scrawlings. Some are just kids writing their names. Others, they're far more important.
It was only when a local historian started analyzing the pieces of the puzzle that the mystery was revealed.
Historical researcher Phil Eden has spent decades piecing together the story of this place.
This is a Royal Artillery fort built 1803 to defend Dover against the perceived threats from Emperor Napoleon, who had amassed his forces over in France. It was deliberately sunk deep into the hill to create a low profile so it can't be seen even today from the centre of Dover town, so people don't even know it's there.
The fort is just part of an extensive defensive network known as Dover Western Heights.
The Western Heights defences is so massive, it's the biggest of its type anywhere in the country.
We're right next to the Straits of Dover, which is the narrowest part of the English Channel.
Up here were heavy guns and artillery ready to engage the French enemy if he had arrived here in southeast Kent.
There is one element that is very impressive and kind of appealing aesthetically, which is this triple staircase.
The 140-foot triple helix design gave 3 separate bands of soldiers direct access to the town below, enabling rapid deployment. But the fortress wouldn't see action until the Second World War. And even then, according to the history books, it simply served as an air raid shelter. Deep inside the fort, Phil made an extraordinary discovery that would contradict that.
There's a piece of graffiti up here that unlocked this mystery. One of the things I thought that I would do whilst investigating the fort was photograph all the graffiti, because it tells you about the men who were stationed up here. These graffiti with a 1942 date Tell us something was going on up here in 1942 that we did not expect to find.
It helped to uncover one of the country's forgotten war missions.
One little bit of graffiti can tell you so much if you're very, very lucky and the right connections are there. And this is what happened with this story.
Phil found out that these initials were made by members of the Royal Commandos, an elite force created by Winston Churchill. He even tracked down a diary written by a private named Tom Overbury, who was in No. 4 Commando.
The diary was wonderful because it did explain all sorts of little snippets that we would never have known. Little personal tales, you don't get any official histories. And I realised this was indeed first-hand report of a very obscure raid to Boulogne called Operation Abercrombie.
Until this revelation, the long-forgotten Operation Abercrombie had never been linked to Dover Western Heights.
Operation Abercrombie was a raid into occupied France. And in the days leading up to it, the troops that were going to conduct the operation were housed at Dover Western Heights.
In April 1942, men arrived here under the cloak of secrecy. And even the men themselves had no idea what awaited them.
They'd been given a cover story for security reasons that they were going to put on an exercise to entertain the king.
Kicking their heels in the fort, many of the soldiers left their mark.
This is William Springer. He was 27 years old when he took part in Operation Abercrombie. He came all the way from New Brunswick in Canada. This is Lance Bombardier Herbert Spike Pike. His nickname was Spike. He was the youngest man No. 4 Commando, and he's left his graffiti here, as you can see, H. Pike. But also, we have on here Private Everett Ricker, who on the commando raid has left his name on the wall here, along with his dart scores. He was playing darts to give him something to do for those 5 nights up in the fort.
Just as it was due to commence, the true purpose of their mission was revealed.
They had to knock out a searchlight and hopefully capture a member of the German garrison and bring him back to interview him or interrogate him to find out the situation and disposition of the German forces in the area.
The 19th of April, 1942. 180 men scrambled to the shore.
They all loaded into 3 assault landing craft. It was a raid against a heavily fortified part of the Atlantic Wall, and nerves must have been incredibly high.
It was just the second raid ever to employ new landing craft support, or LCS boats, armed with machine guns and mortar, and they're beset with difficulties.
The boats lost sight of each other in the night.
Tragically, the sea swamped one of the landing craft and it capsized and turned over. 2 sailors were drowned that day. They had to abandon the operation and then come back into Dover. They stumbled back into the fort, all extremely tired and all very disillusioned. It cast a huge spell on it because you have to remember that a lot of these men had never lost any of their colleagues before.
But giving up is not an option. 2 days later, they set off once again. This time, they make it to the beaches of France.
The British commandos land, and with water up to their knees, wade 200 yards through the shallows and engage the Nazis, but end up taking casualties, including from friendly fire.
Yet, against all odds, they reach their primary objective, the Searchlight Battery.
But just as the men are about to take out the Searchlight, one of their key objectives, the abort signal, goes up.
A German naval patrol had discovered the waiting British boats.
So we don't think the Germans even knew they were there. They simply blundered up to them as part of a routine patrol on the coast. But as such, they encountered British gunboats and a gunfight broke out.
Under fire, both at sea and on land, the commanding British officer called a retreat. Meanwhile, their Canadian counterparts had hit even greater difficulties.
In the gloom, they daren't use their radios because they're only 2 miles offshore and they could be overheard. They all drifted around off the coast. They did not dare risk doing a landing.
The Canadian boats end up losing contact with each other and heading home. The exhausted men arrived back in the morning, totally waterlogged, their faces dripping with black grease paint and morale at an incredible low.
But their reception was far from expected.
When they arrived back at Dover, they were all amazed because they'd been on this miserable operation. They had failed in all their objectives. And they got back and were confronted by news crews ready to do a film that had already been pre-scripted to say what a wonderful success they had. And none of it was true.
Cooperation between commandos and the Royal Navy was again the chief reason for the success of another raid on the French coast, this time near Boulogne.
Despite the claims of the propaganda newsreel, many lives were lost. However, the British continued to spread the fake news.
It's shown around the world as an example of the Allies giving the Nazis a black eye.
To end the story, a few of the boys after the party. Faces still black, spirits still high.
If you watch the footage, you'd be forgiven for thinking it was a massive success.
Britain's wartime leaders wanted to promote the failed Operation Abercrombie as a triumph. Meanwhile, their Canadian allies wanted to bury the disaster immediately.
The Canadian involvement in Abercrombie was kept silent because it was too embarrassing for Ottawa and the British High Command to admit that there'd been a massive failure.
When D-Day finally came, the testing of the LCS boats during Operation Abercrombie made a valuable contribution to the Allies' ultimate victory.
One of the major takeaways of the operation is just how difficult it would be to land a liberation army into France.
After the Second World War, Dover Western Heights fell into disrepair and was eventually abandoned, and Operation Abercrombie was soon forgotten. Phil's investigations into the fast-fading graffiti continue to this day.
Literally just stumbled over a new piece of graffiti. It looks to me that this number is 17817 CYR, a Canadian infantryman from Operation Abercrombie. I'll determine who he was and contact his family, filling a little bit of past their family history.
In eastern Armenia, a dramatic landscape reflects a nation's past.
We see an horizon that's been punctuated by rocky outcrops.
There are these massive rock pillars that come straight out of the ground, almost as if you're in the middle of a stone forest.
You can also see openings, sort of dark mouths that are the entrances to natural caves.
Amid this warren, signs of life gradually begin to emerge.
There's clearly some chisel marks on the edge of some of the rocks.
What made people build families and communities here?
This remote village contains evidence that it was once keenly fought over.
This is clearly the resting place of some important people. These solid stone tombs have writings and illustrations engraved into them.
It's a place built with survival in mind.
The people that created this village had a plan about how they would survive here.
Until it all came to a sudden end.
Former farmer and one-time resident Savada Shanazarian remembers when people still lived in these caves.
Когда по мосту ходишь, вот этот, красота, все чувствуешь. Я еще здесь родилась, жил в пещерном доме.
The cave village of Kunzeresk sits in the Siunik province of eastern Armenia, where the dramatic landscape is the result of a violent geology.
It's a landscape that's been molded by volcanoes, almost like a natural rock cement.
Beneath the rugged slopes, a labyrinth of caves and passageways is linked by a bizarre system of ropes and ladders.
The people use the geological formations to their advantage by actually carving further into them and creating dwellings.
Вообще, это возраст этого села где-то 3000 лет. Люди жили в пещерах. Первоначально люди жили в пещерах хоть 50 тысяч лет назад, хоть 100.
By 189 BC, the cave village of Kunzeresk was known to be part of the ancient kingdom of Armenia.
Наши предки все время жили здесь. Около 700 лет. Уже мы знаем, да? Те фотки здесь фоткались. В старом Kunzeresk. Мне здесь, наверное, 7 лет, вот так. Мой мама, он 1930 года рождения, а здесь это бабушка. Все я сам видел, пещерную жизнь, как жили, как согрели пещеру. Это помню хорошо.
As many as 2,000 cave houses cram below the mountainsides.
At the beginning of the 20th century, this was a thriving town, a large village with thousands of people. There were shops and businesses and a thriving commerce here.
The stone tunnels sheltered this community from threats to their very existence.
It was fear that led people to make their homes in caves.
But who or what were they afraid of? Kunzeresk's churches provide a significant clue.
В старом Kunzeresке 4 церкви было. Вот один из них, это самый большой, Святой Репсимен называется. Построили в 1665 году.
Traditionally, the inhabitants of Kunzeresk have been Armenian Christians. But something happened here to force them to take refuge below ground. The Siunik province has long been fought over.
Where we are is a crossroads between different civilizations, all of whom claim this place as their own.
You don't want to be living out on the plains in really obvious, easily attackable housing.
The Armenians soon realized that the best home was one that they wouldn't have to rebuild after every time the invaders came in.
У нас такие пещеры есть, которые выше от земли 10-15 метров. Когда напали на нас, вот такой веревки поднялись, туда стреляли, женщин, детей спрятали. Вот поэтому в таких местах жили. Здесь от врагов спасаться намного легко было, и никогда не могли завоевать. Они веревки поднялись в верхние пещеры, укрылись оттуда, стреляли, защищались от врагов.
Over the centuries, the people of Kunzeresk managed to survive invasion from all directions. But by the 18th century, it was being threatened by the Ottoman Empire. And in the Siunik province, the famous Armenian leader Mikita Sparapet was leading a resistance to the invaders.
In the 1730s, Sparapet was on the run and he led a guerrilla campaign from these valleys. He was involved in a number of these key battles against the invaders.
But Sparapet met an untimely end in the village of Kunzeresk.
Но мы сейчас подходим к могиле Мухтара Спарапета. Вот эта могила.
The Armenian hero didn't die at the hands of the invading Ottomans.
In a shocking moment of treachery, Sparapet was actually murdered by the same people that he was fighting for.
To keep the invaders sweet, the villagers decided to kill their leader, Mikhitar Sparapet, and gain favor with the Ottoman general, the Pasha.
Mikita's people turned against him, beheaded him, and took his head to the Pasha, perhaps hoping for some sort of reward.
The Pasha thought the betrayal was detestable, and he actually had these people decapitated as punishment as well.
But the cave village of Kunzeresk survived, and over the coming centuries, it thrived. By the time it became part of the USSR in 1922, it was still a bustling community. But following the Second World War, the emerging Soviet superpower wanted to make its mark on the world stage.
The idea that people might live in caves doesn't fit the agenda of forming and developing a modern, powerful superpower.
The Soviet system eroded Kunzeresk's unique way of life.
Была при советской власти, в этом церкви кино показывали, как кинотеатр служит.
So after almost 1,000 years of habitation, that settlement was forcibly removed.
Today, a bridge spans Kunzeresk from old to new. And the great military general entombed in the graveyard is celebrated by the descendants of those who killed him.
They have a Sarapat Day on the 12th of September to celebrate this general as a great general leader in a fight for freedom in Armenia.
In Argentina, in the center of metropolitan Buenos Aires, a rural structure is strangely out of place.
The building looks like something you might come across in the French countryside.
The wooden window frames are cracked and the walls a little weathered, but otherwise it seems to be in fairly good condition.
The inside is bereft of clues to its origins.
It's really quite hard to get a sense of purpose of the different rooms.
Although there's a simplicity to this place, there are hints of luxury, like ornate chandeliers hanging from the ceiling.
This is no ordinary chalet.
You peer out of the windows and you realize that you're high up above Buenos Aires.
How did this European-looking structure end up on top of a roof in Latin America?
Esta historia ya traspasa solamente lo que es la ciudad de Buenos Aires. Es una historia que está en todo el país de la Argentina.
The turn of the 20th century was a boom time for the Argentinian capital. Immigrants came from all over the world to make their fortune. The quirky wonder, hidden among the city's rooftops, is part of Diego Sesson's family history.
Para la familia el chalet es importante porque es un lugar de unión, es un lugar donde se cumplieron muchos sueños, es un ícono y un lugar de amor.
Overlooking the world's widest street, the 9th of July Avenue, the chalet has 2 floors and a mezzanine. Its striking design is influenced by a medieval style of architecture usually found in Normandy, France.
Llegamos a la planta baja del chalet. Lo que nos queda es este mueble que es un esquinero, estilo de campo. Estamos ahora en lo que vendría a ser el cuarto de almuerzo, un lugar donde se juntaba parte de la familia para pasar un rato juntos.
This unusual cottage-like building was the vision of one man.
Bueno, él es Raphael Diaz, mi bisabuelo.
The story of Raphael Diaz is a real window into an era of Argentina's history. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, Argentina was really booming. For a lot of Europeans who wanted to emigrate for greater opportunities, this was a place with lots of opportunities, lots of growth.
In 1886, aged 15, Raphael Diaz emigrated to Buenos Aires from Valencia, Spain. He arrived with his mother, and the pair came with little more than the clothes on their backs. Raphael managed to find work in a fabric shop and soon began working for furniture manufacturers. But it wasn't long before he was looking for more.
He tripled the sales of one company he was working for, and that got him to thinking, why was he busy lining the pockets of someone else?
Diaz realized there was a market that wasn't being exploited. It was people like him. There was a growing middle class in Argentina, and many of them were recent immigrants.
And he was going to build a company to manufacture and sell the best furniture in Argentina. And he used some very modern business practices. He published a catalog, so for people who weren't able to visit his showroom in Buenos Aires could look through the catalog and order what they wanted.
Soon he was selling it all around the country, and business was booming.
As profits soared, the obsessive eccentric looked around for a showcase for his successful business. And in the 1920s, he came across the perfect spot.
He knew that the city was planning on tearing down some buildings and building a grand central avenue through the middle of the city. If he could have a showroom overlooking that avenue, that would be a prime location.
Cuando se entera que viene la 9 de julio, como dije, va por su último gran sueño. Y dar el mejor servicio que pueda a todo el mundo. Y literalmente fue a toda la Argentina. 9 pisos de muebles, pisos de 800 metros cuadrados.
His new superstore would also offer a unique solution to a problem that had been troubling both him and his family.
Diaz worked all the time. He was missing time with his family. And then he had a brainstorm. What if, in addition to building my 9-story showroom for my business, I also built a little home away from home right on top.
It was a towering vision. But the eccentric Raphael Diaz was the one man who could pull it off.
If you look at that chalet on top of that building, it's a kind of a gag, it's a visual joke, but it's also kind of a statement from the heart about what Diaz valued. He's in this high-tech downtown, but he yearns to be in the peaceful countryside with his family. And I just think there's something heartwarming about that.
He would come up to his private getaway for lunch and a little siesta between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. every day.
Y eso creo que es el secreto de este lugar. El secreto es que todo fue para el trabajo.
Raphael Diaz also knew the value of good marketing, and he put his highly visible building to great use.
This was something you could see practically from miles around. Everybody in Buenos Aires knew that that was the most famous furniture store in town.
Instead of spending money on adverts in the papers, his little chalet on top of the store became a uniquely recognizable symbol of his business.
The Muebles Diaz furniture store thrived for many more decades. And the calming rooms of Raphael's rooftop chalet helped him live to 97.
Raphael Diaz passed away in 1968, and the business, along with the chalet, were passed down to his children.
Less than 2 decades later, the Muebles Diaz furniture shop closed, and the superstore was converted into offices.
As the city developed and neon signs covered up the heights, the chalet where Raphael Diaz spent his time at noon was gradually obscured. And eventually, it was abandoned.
Today, Diego has ambitions to put his great-grandfather's chalet to a new use.
Diego hopes to open it as a restaurant and a cultural space. And it'll be quite a thing coming up here, with its views all over the heart of the city. What an amazing location.
In a typical Berlin suburb, a perplexing block sits nestled in the trees.
As we enter the busy residential area of Tempelhof, we see a large concrete structure.
It's a brutal block of concrete. It's a huge cylinder that looks completely out of place, and it makes you think that it might be a remnant of wartime Berlin.
But as we approach this concrete structure, we still don't know what it's about. It gets stranger as we get closer.
Initially, you think it might be some sort of air raid structure, but when you get inside, it's mostly solid, and there's very little interior space, so it's all a little puzzling.
This hasn't got ventilation, it hasn't got the windows, so this is not what we're used to seeing. What is it?
Part of a fantastical project, it would facilitate the construction of buildings so large they had the potential to create their own atmosphere. Ingmar Arnold studies this structure and its unusual purpose. He's well used to people mistaking it for something it's not.
I believe this is an air raid shelter or something like that, but it is no air raid shelter. It is concrete. This is the only thing they have in common, but this was not made to protect people, but just to protect the results of science, experimental science.
The largely solid concrete tube allows for limited interior space.
This is more or less the only room. It was an experimental building just for research.
A few rusty instruments are all that's left of those tests. But it's what you can't see that gives away this site's true purpose.
The foundation is 36 feet in diameter and reaches 60 feet into the ground.
These colossal foundations point to its purpose, as does its name, literally translated as heavy load-bearing body.
And this building is called Schwerbelastungskörper. That means it's a body that is made to prove the stability of the ground. So to put a pressure on the ground to see how the soil reacts to a heavy white building like this one.
The area was sandy and marshy, but they wanted to build a massive structure here.
That structure was a grand arch, 3 times the size of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. It was just part of the Führer's maniacal plan to transform Berlin. It would be designed by Hitler's right-hand man, Albert Speer.
Albert Speer was the Nazi regime's architect and technocrat. He was a guy who could take the Nazi ideas and translate them into engineering reality.
Speer followed, and Speer tried to fulfill the dreams of Hitler.
This concrete cylinder was to test the weight exerted on just one of the 4 pillars that would support the huge arch.
Speer has got to be certain that the ground on which one day he will build the biggest triumphal arch in the world is not gonna let it sink.
That was a real risk, given Berlin's notoriously unstable ground. In 1941, French laborers were forced to start pouring the concrete. When finished, the load-bearing body weighed more than 12,500 tons. But it was just a tiny piece of a grand puzzle.
It is part of something much bigger that has not been completed, that would rival anything that had been created in Paris or London. It would be the center of a Germanic civilization.
The heavy load-bearing structure was just a small part of a program that defied comprehension. Hitler's monstrous plan to transform Berlin into the capital of the world. It would be called Germania.
In 1938, Adolf Hitler set forward his plans for redesigning how Germany was perceived. Part of that meant creating a new Berlin.
Speer created models, but not shown to the public, of course. Only for Speer and Hitler, more or less. These models, these original models, have been destroyed probably in the last days of the war. So this is a reconstruction of how it might look like.
The scale of the plans were monumental, beyond anything ever witnessed before. Hitler wanted his new city of Germania to draw on the great civilizations of the past.
Adolf Hitler was aware of the pyramids, the Acropolis in Athens, and the Colosseum in Rome, and he wanted to outdo those civilizations.
And he wanted to show that Germany is the power #1 in the world, and this should be represented in the capital. He imitated a little bit other cities, for instance, with the Triumph Arch Paris, or maybe even a little bit Washington, D.C.
Berlin has got to be better than Paris, so the boulevards will be wider than Paris.
Supported by the hidden test cylinder, Hitler's triumphal arch was planned to take pride of place. The highway would have been built up and elevated so that the top of the cylinder would have been under the new level of the ground. Towering nearly 400 feet, the arch would carry the names of Germany's 1.8 million fallen of the First World War engraved upon its walls. It stood at the end of one of the 2 massive boulevards that was central to Hitler's plan. This north-south axis would run from the arch to the largest covered space in the world, the Great Hall. It would be intersected by an east-west axis, with colossal structures erected along its stretch. The 20th of April, 1939, Hitler's 50th birthday. With most of Germania still at the planning stage, Albert Speer's newly created east-west axis is open to celebrate the occasion, with a mammoth ceremony and military parade.
This represents people trying to immortalize themselves through architecture, which is a common dynamic with totalitarian regimes. He was trying to secure his legacy for millennia to come.
That immortality would be created and maintained in its buildings, no matter how many people had to die to build those structures.
The creation of these Nazi structures drove the expansion of the concentration camps in order to supply their demand for forced labor. As the heavy load-bearing body was completed, Berliners were being driven from swathes of the city earmarked for demolition, often moved to the homes of Jews already sent to ghettos and concentration camps.
This district would have been changed completely by Germania. Most of the houses would have been destroyed.
Hitler's delusional designs depended on victory, which looked like a foregone conclusion when construction of the cylinder began. But 3 years later, things looked very different. June 1944, D-Day. The Western Allies land in France. The Red Army is encroaching in the east.
Nazi Germany was now being caught between the hammer and the anvil. Away from the fanciful ideas of painting the world in a new light, now the Nazis were confronted with the reality that they had not won the war, that all of their effort needed to be concentrated on surviving what was to come.
By this stage, the Nazi regime had no resources for Hitler's maniacal projects. And when Germany finally lost the war, one of the few things to have been completed was the heavy load-bearing body.
There was little appetite, let alone the means, to remove something so gargantuan. So essentially, it remains there as a remnant of Hitler's grandiose vision for himself and his legacy.
Today, the towering cylinder bears silent witness to those who died in pursuit of Hitler's crazed vision.
This building was a building that shouldn't stand here very long, not longer than 20 weeks, but it is the only surviving fragment of this planning.
It's almost part of nature now. It's just become part of the terrain.